Welcome everyone to the second annual top 10 lists of the year for TCG Aesthetics. My name is Tom, and I'm coming at you live this time because I'm doing things a little bit differently this year. Last year, I had my top 10 games, my top 5 albums, and my top 5 TV shows all in the same video. But over the past year, I've realized that I actually listen to a fair amount of music, much more music in a much wider variety of music than I have played video games. So I felt the need to separate the two lists into two separate videos. So this video will be specifically focusing on the albums. The next video that I release, which will be in about a week, will be the top 10 video games that I played, just like normal. The ground rules for all the lists remains the same. It has to be an album that I have listened to this year all the way through. I can't have halfway listened to an album. I mean, who would ever do that? I'm not placing any preferential weight on albums that have been released sooner. I mean, I typically tend to listen to albums that have been released semi-recently, but as you'll see on this list, there are quite a few albums that are, I guess you could consider classics, but I was first introduced to them this year. So that is another criteria. I had to have listened to them for the first time this year. All right, so let's get into it. Coming in at number 10 is the Thank You Scientist album, Stranger Heads Prevail. I was introduced to this album kind of by chance. It just popped up on my Spotify one day, and I was intrigued by the sound of the main single from this album, Mr. Invisible, because I'm pretty familiar with jazz fusion. I've listened to Snarky Puppy for a long time, and I've since gone back and explored the origins of the genre with Miles Davis and all that. And even more recently, I've been getting into modern progressive rock and progressive metal, or what considered prog these days. And I've, on the record, stated that I don't think that these two genres mix very well. Very often when metal artists introduce some jazz into their music, they don't really have the jazz chops to really make it sing as well as I think it deserves. So it's surprising that this album and this band really was able to strike a balance between these two genres that I really enjoy. There's elements of progressive rock, odd meters, very heavy guitar riffs, mixed in with some like big band jazz influence. It's strange, but it works really well. And the hooks and the singing are both top notch. The singer, I think, can get maybe a little bit bland after a while, but it's so clean the way he articulates everything, and he just it's very technically proficient, which I enjoy a lot. I'm a big fan of technical proficiency. And that level of skill is not exclusive to the vocalist on this record. I believe every single musician that's in this ensemble performs exquisitely. And I don't use words like that often. Number 9 on the list is the album Home by Billy Strings. I know that Billy Strings released an album in 2021, but I haven't listened to it enough times to fully know whether or not I think it's better than the Home album or not, but I've definitely listened to Home a fair amount this year. Home is one of those albums that, ironically enough, I got into basically only because of the album art. I mean, fucking look at that. Like, when I saw that, I had to take a listen, and I was not disappointed. It's very often when you look at album art, you're kind of rolling the dice a little bit, but I was very surprised to listen to this album and enjoy it as much as I have. Home is a folk singer-songwriter album. I have been somewhat familiar with the modern folk genre because I've listened to bands like Nickel Creek and Punch Brothers, but I haven't really explored the intricacies of the genre too much. But this album, to my ears, is a fantastic modern example of what the folk genre can produce in the landscape of the modern music industry. The main appeals that I look for in most of the folk projects that I listen to is I want it to have good storytelling, and I want it to have fast and intricate musical instrument playing. And this album certainly does not disappoint. Billy Strings is an extremely virtuosic guitar player, and his lyrics are very well thought out and I think convey an important message at times. This is also a pretty hefty project, coming in at just underneath an hour. I was surprised that I was able to stay engaged throughout all of it, considering how not well versed I am with the genre as a whole, but Billy seems to come through with a pretty consistent and well-sequenced track list. I'm a big fan of the forward-thinking production on this record, and I definitely think it's going to stay in my rotation for a while. All right, what do we got next? Between Wind and Water by The Longest Johns. Now, I'm sure all of you are very well aware of the shanty talk memes that were popping up at the very beginning of 2021. And that is how I got introduced to this album, but I think you'd be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't pop on this album and check out some of the other songs that The Longest Johns have performed here. Most of them are covers of some old classic shanty tunes, Holloway, Joe, Woodpile, Banks of Newfoundland. But I think it's performed extremely well. I don't know, maybe it's because I have a soft spot for a cappella music, but I just really enjoy listening to this music in the cold weather. It's very much a winter album. When I first got introduced to this album, I was actually shoveling, and I think most of these tunes are made for work. They're like work music, if I understand shanties correctly. I mean, I don't, but what I do know is that the music on this album, while it is a bit simplistic in nature and can get repetitive at times, I really, really enjoy just the physical aspect of it. Put this album on when you're running around the neighborhood and it's like 27 degrees outside, and I guarantee you will shave 2 minutes off your time. Easily. I am fully aware of the fact that I'm probably going to get memed for putting this in my top 10 list, but it's a good album, and I think that more people should check it out. 7 on the list is an album called Bring Backs by Alfa Mist. This album was released in 2021, so don't you go telling me that I don't listen to modern music. This is a tight, succinct neo-soul project from producer, composer, singer, rapper Alfa Mist with an F. I'm a fan of just how loose this album is, and I use that term not to say that it's sloppy or anything, because it most certainly is not. The musicians on the album play excellently, but it seems to me that one of the main focuses of this record was to allow the musicians to play and improvise in a free and unfiltered manner, and I think that comes across really well. It's not trying to produce this hefty, very dense jazz monstrosity. It almost simulates a night at like a small dive bar in downtown London, and people are smoking inside, and you've got a couple jazz musicians playing some neo soul. When you leave so much of your album up to improvisation, you can run the risk of letting these songs become a little bit too disjointed from each other, but the addition of the spoken word poem that's sprinkled throughout the track list on this album, it really adds a good sense of cohesion to the entire project. And I think that spoken word poetry in and of itself can come off a little bit cringy if it's not performed well, but I mean, obviously, I think it is performed very well. Mr. Mist has some... I can't say that with a straight face. Mr. Mist has a variety of collaborators that he has worked with on previous projects that show up on this one, and I think that their chemistry has only improved as they've known each other and worked together for a longer period of time. It's a great album to sit by a fire and relax and think about the state of the world that we're in, and you might need an album like that after the next album on my list, which is Underneath by Code Orange. As I said when I was talking about the Thank You Scientist album, I've been getting into progressive metal recently, and also just modern metal music in general, and the heftier side of what music can offer. And I think that Code Orange, specifically on this album, makes a strong case that metal music is not going anywhere. They seem to thread the needle of having heavy, soul-crushing, just brutal, flammable riffs mixed in with catchy lyrics and sticky and pretty sweet hooks and riffs every now and then. The brutality on display here in terms of the instrumentals is definitely not for everyone. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but for me personally, I absolutely love it. I love the virtuosity of the musicians. I love the composition and also the production of these like glitch elements where there are like little moments of pause and silence every now and then. It's executed very well, and it clearly there was a lot of time and effort put into just making the entire composition speak the way that the composer wanted it to. I'm also a very, very big fan of good screaming music. Like, that is something that I have specifically gotten into a lot this year. Is I really do appreciate when a vocalist can scream and not sound like he's like killing himself, if that makes sense. There are a lot of metal artists that you listen to and you hear them scream and you're like, that person is in pain. They're going to lose their voice in 2 years. It's kind of hard to explain, but when you hear someone scream, you can, especially if you're listening to them singing lyrics or speaking lyrics, screaming lyrics, whatever you want to say, you can hear a degree of relaxation that allows them to scream for a extended period of time without, cutting off their own airflow. It's something that low-key I hope to be able to imitate in the future. But anyway, brutal and fantastic metal album. There's not a single track on this album that I do not love. And yeah, that's why it's coming in at number 6. Number 5 on the list, halfway through at this point, is another metal album, a progressive metal album that I, again, think threads the needle between the cozy and the cacophonous, and that would be Coma Ecliptic by Between the Buried and Me. See, with Code Orange, they kind of want to meld the sounds of the clean vocals and the scream vocals in a way that makes the project sound consistent all the way through, but I think Between the Buried and Me takes pretty much the polar opposite approach to that idea, where they want to make the clean vocals sound so extremely clean and the screamed vocals sound so extremely dirty that they clash intentionally, in my opinion, in a way that gives this whole project a sort of tension to it. Between the Buried and Me has come out with another album in 2021, and I did listen to that a lot, but at the end of the day, Coma Ecliptic was the one that I listened to first, and I still think that it holds up a bit better than the more recent album. That's not to say that the more recent album is not good. Definitely, if you enjoy Coma Ecliptic, check out the new one, but I have my preferences. This is one of the longer albums on the list, coming in at 1 hour and 8 minutes, but I think that there are so many good hooks on the album that you kind of are fed these breadcrumbs throughout the entire track list that keep you invested. And like most of the albums on this list, there is some extremely good virtuosic playing from the musicians on display here. This album is a concept album, so there is an overarching story for those who want to dive deeper into the lyrics, but if you don't, then I would still say that there's plenty in this album to enjoy outside of that. I wouldn't personally put this at the top of my list of all the Gent albums that I've listened to. That still goes to Language by the Contortionists, which was number 1 last year, but I would still say that this album definitely exemplifies pretty much everything that I love about the genre. Next up, we have an album that I had listened to before 2021, but it wasn't really until this year that I really listened to it intently and understood the genius that is the ArchAndroid by Janelle Monae. This is a heavy and conceptual pop album that swings across multiple genres and multiple influences that span from jazz to dance to funk music and even some classic rock at some points. Monae is able to use these genres as colors, essentially mixing them together and painting us this technicolor dreamscape picture of a futuristic sci-fi society. And as we dive deeper into this project, the details only become more defined. One of the things that I really, really appreciate about the medium of an album specifically is the fact that on repeat listens, you can continuously discover new things about the album. For example, on your first listen, you're certainly not going to know that Suite 3 is a call forward to the closing track on the album, Ba Ba Ya. Ba 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 Ya. And since the first 4 songs all flow into each other seamlessly, you might not even realize that they are multiple songs unless you're looking at whatever you're playing it on go down the track list. In terms of the narrative of this album, I think it's expertly woven into the instrumentals and hooks, and I think that it's simple enough to understand after a couple of listens, but it definitely offers a lot more details if you are willing to deep dive into the lyrics. This is about as close as you can get to what I would consider to be a perfect album, and when I use that phrase, I'm not really thinking about like whether or not there are any things about it that I personally like or disliked, but I'm specifically thinking about the root of the word perfect, which is Latin for complete. There is not a single aspect of this album that you could take away without severely damaging it. And at the same time, if you added something, it would only seem superfluous. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this specific set of tracks are expertly linked together, and they exemplify what I really love about just having an album experience in the first place. Speaking of perfect albums, number 3 on the list is Crack the Skye by the legendary sledge metal band Mastodon. This is the best metal album that I have listened to, period. If you are new to metal music or just heavier music in general, I would highly, highly recommend this album. Almost every song has a hook to it, or some form of clean or pitched melodic vocal, which for me goes a long way, especially since those vocals are written and performed extremely well. There are some elements of early progressive metal that show up on this record, but mostly it's very straightforward and very digestible. That's not to say that it doesn't have some blistering moments in it. It certainly does. It's sort of like a food analogy incoming. It's sort of like a nice spicy dish that has a complex blend of spices. It's not trying to hurt you, but it is trying to make your mouth tingle a little bit. I think what really gets me about this album is just the amount of beauty that's on it in the writing and in the lyricism and the sentimentality of it all. The album is sort of a fictionalization of the family of the czars after the Russian Revolution. And it's clear that throughout the album, the protagonist goes through a lot of mental and emotional anguish and strife. There's certainly anger at some points that can't be denied, but it's very sullen and somber. There is a triumphant ending and some fairly soaring hooks on the album, but they're all bittersweet with the context that the album provides. Also, I just sort of love the high fantasy aspects that are woven into the music. For example, the music box at the beginning of the titular track, Crack the Skye. That and the harmonized vocals in the hook at the beginning and end of The Tsar. Overall, it's just one of the most legendary and iconic metal records that exists, and I'm glad that I was exposed to it this past year. Number 2 is yet another neo-soul project that released this year that occasionally wanders into the realm of jazz fusion, and that is the album Bones by Mayo. The vocals, composition, harmonies, and many other aspects of this album are reminiscent, to me at least, of Jacob Collier's music. But unlike Jacob Collier, who can get wrapped into the theory and the, how should I put this delicately? It sounds like half the time his music is stuffed up his own ass. Michael seems to be more content to give the listener a little bit more to latch onto, if that makes sense. I think it's a sign of a very good album if you can look at the track list and know what every song sounds like. There's just so many good moments on it. It's kind of hard for me to even describe. I'm trying to think of something to start out with, but there are just so many. I'll start out by complimenting his voice. I think I've recently come to understand or get sort of an ear for what instrument a song was written for. And I think that Michael Mayo probably wrote most of these songs specifically for his voice. From even the very first song on the album, The Way, the hook on that song is covered in these lush harmonies. And then we have Stolen Moments, which is an a cappella song on the album, but you might not even realize that it's a cappella because he does some fairly odd things with his voice, and not even just on this song specifically, but throughout the whole album. It's like he's not afraid of looking stupid, and therefore he doesn't look stupid. Like, it's so weird the way he's able to manipulate his voice to make different timbres and sounds, because he's not going for notes and chords and harmonies. He's going for sounds in the purest sense of the word. But it's not just the voice that's impressive on this album, as has been the case for many of the albums on this list. The instrumental playing is top notch, especially the percussionist, the drum set player, whoever's playing the drums of this album is going pretty hard, which is something that I, as someone who plays drums, appreciate a lot. There's no overarching story to this album. It's not a concept album, but I don't think an album needs to have a story in order to convey a very personal and affecting message. I think that one of the most appealing things about Michael Mayo's writing as a lyricist is that he's not reaching too far for these heavy metaphors or complex imagery or anything like that. To me, it sounds like he's just writing the world as he sees it and just writing honestly from his perspective, which is something that I think is too often overlooked in terms of just the importance of writing in general. For me, sincerity trumps cleverness, although there is a fair amount of both on this album. Before we get to number one on the list, I'm just going to throw out some honorable mentions, some albums that I really loved this year, but weren't quite on par with the albums in this list. It was a tough decision, and they just barely missed the cut, so here they are. The first is Vector, the best Haken album, At Me, You Cowards. Then we have An Evening with Silk Sonic, fantastic album, and after that we have One of Us is the Killer, Dillinger Escape Plan, brutal, brutal metal album, the hardest that I have ever gone while listening to an album that you can truly commit arson to. Then we have The Source, an album by Ayreon, a progressive metal artist who pulls together many, many different artists and vocalists from other progressive metal bands and strings together a fantastic and lengthy metal project that is well worth listening to. And last but certainly not least, we have the Amanuensis, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from Monuments, a gent band that is fairly stock in the music that they produce, but I think it's performed extremely well, and the hooks and screaming on the album are very, very enjoyable. All right, it's time for the number one album that I listened to this year. The best album that I've heard in quite a while, and something that has personally affected me on a very profound level, but also just objectively, if I get to say objectively, an insanely good record. The best album that I listened to this year is an album called Blomljud by Moon Safari. This is a relatively old record, but it's not that old. It only sounds older than it is because it is a progressive rock album, and progressive rock in the true sense, as in like taking inspiration from the old masters of the genre, Genesis, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, that sort of thing. This is by far the longest album on the list at 1 hour and 43 minutes, but I would not give up a single minute of it. Some of you may have seen the vocal cover that I did of the opening track to this album, Constant Bloom. But what you probably don't know is that the two verses of that song are motifs that reappear constantly throughout the course of the album, which just demonstrates how well this album was thought out conceptually. This album had a very profound effect on me personally because it's so sincere. And I know I was talking about sincerity with Michael Mayo just now, but it crops up again here because I think for a lot of people, it's easy to express emotions of sadness or anger in a very intense way because they're very natural emotions that have a degree of intensity to them. But I think it's hard for, or maybe harder for people to express happiness in a very intense way. Or maybe it's just me. This album makes me nostalgic for a time that I was less cynical about the world. It is an album that I listen to when I feel hopeless. Wow, are we really gonna go here? This is the sort of album that will remind you why life is worth living, or at least that's how it worked for me. There's a fair amount of nature worship on this album, and it sort of reminds me of the way that storytelling used to be. The lyrics come across as ancient almost, like they're trying to tap into something that was perhaps lost as soon as human society got old enough to push nature to the side. And yet, the lyrics also are modern enough because they were written in a modern context that they reference movements in human society that are more favorable to nature. There is a fair amount of melancholy on the album, but at the end of the day, it's more appreciative that any of us got the opportunity to be in contact with nature at all. And the rest of us trying to cling to the beauty that's left in this world. It doesn't hurt that the arrangements and compositions on this album are also incredibly fire. I really appreciate that the vocals that crop up on this album are actually all of the band members. I think every member of the band sings in some respect on this album. I just love hearing the different timbres of each of the members' voices come together and add some variety to the vocals. The writing is super clever in terms of meters and chord structures, and again, I will remind people of the motifs that happen throughout the album. Here's something that I realized about myself when I was listening to this album is that I let musical aspects affect me more than lyrical aspects. And an example of this would be in the fourth song, Moonwalk, when the guitar, or maybe it's the synth, calls back to the first melody on the album in Constant Bloom. I just broke down crying. It affects me on a deeply emotional level to know that someone had put that much thought into something that they created. Yeah, it's just a fantastic album. And that is the top 10 list of albums that I have listened to this past year in 2021. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in supporting my channel further, you can hit up the link to my Patreon in the description below. I'll see you next week for the top 10 games of 2021. See ya. Drink some water.